And I will hand over to Pascal to introduce yourself, Pascal, and introduce a little bit about today's session.
All right, thank you very much, Emma. Thanks very much. And very good morning, everyone. And thanks for joining us today. I think what I would like to share with you is some of the things that I've been talking to organizational leaders about for nearly 10 years now across the world. I mean, in hindsight, it would have been probably my preference to have this session before Christmas. But of course, there's a consolation that always, I think the world every 10 to 15 years would always encounter something of this nature that would eventually lead to some sort of global shock. So some of the things that we're talking about today would eventually be useful now and also in the future. So, but I'm going to theme it around just 4 areas. So I'm looking at the psychology behind crisis leadership and why that is important, but also leading us through the COVID crisis, and then re-entry, and then towards recovery. I mean, we know that the way organizations are set up, they are not set up really to deal with crises of this magnitude, not just COVID, but even with the 2008 economic crisis, we saw that because organizations are siloed into cash flow, HR, marketing, and what have you. So what is happening today, you will find that the COVID is not just a global health crisis. It has disrupted our lives, businesses across the world, and leaders are really scrambling to find a solution. And the reason is simple, because crisis itself causes distress and uncertainty. So I think the initial reaction, as I was sharing with Emma, is often the case that you either get fear, panic, flight, or even fight. But effective organizational leaders, in my view, they must have the ability and the agility to actually ease distress by helping people, especially their employees, to make sense of what is a confusing predicament, okay? So if you indulge me, the first 10 minutes, I will use it to probably share some of my thoughts. And then after 10 minutes, you feel free to just dip in terms of asking me questions or whatever, and then we can probably probe along those particular sort of questions, if you like. In any crisis, you get 2 types of people emerging as a leader. It doesn't matter if it's within a big organization or a small organization, or even sole trader, because you have to also deal with other people, even if you're a sole trader. But you get 2 types of people. So you find that some people will lose faith in the organization, and also particularly in the leaders. But you would also get another people who are at the other end of the continuum, who would actually double their efforts, if you like, and their commitment. But for effective leadership to actually hold, it is critically important, in my view, that employees are constantly reassured about the integrity of the organization, as well as its long-term viability. And what we've seen with the COVID crisis is that many industry leaders have suddenly realized that the fragility of their corporate crisis management frameworks and systems, constrained by the ubiquity of health and safety, because that is all what we know in England and the UK, albeit good, they were simply too inadequate, too rigid, and too backward-looking to actually respond resiliently to any crisis of this magnitude. And I think that is where my taxonomy actually comes in terms of, sense making. So how can leaders actually come in to take hold and reassure people. And I suppose the main question will be how, if you like. So some of the things I'm about to share with you it's not rocket science. It's not probably some of the things you don't already know. But I hope that from our interaction, you will get a new sense or a new direction from it. So I think that's where what I call sense making comes in. So sense making comes in, I mean, that should be the first task to my mind in any crisis. So leaders should attempt to make people understand the crisis as it unravels, if you like. So that is recognize and mobilize for the crisis. And of course, this would involve understanding and addressing barriers to that recognition of the crisis. Because some people don't even take it serious or even understand there is a crisis. So there has to be a mechanism whereby leaders actually get that message across. But also deal with organizational limitations. If you go back to how I started, procedures, processes, systems in organizations are actually constraining. They're not as flexible as to allow people to actually respond with agility. And I think that's where leaders actually step in by then using those processes, looking at it, evaluating it, but also in the context of how the crisis is actually affecting people psychologically. And I think that's where the psychological dimensions actually of sense making come in. So you're looking at stress, you're looking at performance, you're looking at reality testing, you know. Then that takes you have to make decision. You have to take decision as to what to do. So because I'm a great believer in, I'm a great advocate of taking things in phases, taking things systematically, taking issues and situations in chunks. In that way, you're much more able to actually be in depth and have a breadth. And then the outcome and the impact can actually be felt much more deeply and also much more widely. So I've always advised leaders to, when they are taking decisions, to be inclusive about it. So they have to evaluate alternatives and also make critical choices. And that would involve building teams and also implementation with the crisis coordination, okay? So it may not be a replica of what you already have. It might actually be an avant-garde version of what that organization might become post the crisis. So you're looking at putting a crisis leadership in place. That's critically important. Then that will take you to the next one. People have to make meanings out of it. So you're within the phase where I'm calling meaning making. So this would involve crisis management as effective communication. So you use communication as your tool. So the actions of communicating in crisis is obviously different from the action of communicating after crisis or when there's no crisis. So you're talking to people who may be directly or indirectly inside and outside the organization affected by the crisis. And it's important that, of course, in doing so, you maintain the credibility of the organization. That is key. That is very, very key, if you like. Then we're looking at what point can you then say we are probably getting behind the curve to begin to terminate that crisis, to say, okay, we're no longer in a crisis mode or whatever. And it simply refers to how crises end. And what you may find there's what I call blame gaming. So people are looking for who to blame for what has happened, if you like. But also actions that may or may not be in the interest of the organization. And also challenges, if you like. But also increasingly, people will be held, if you like, accountable. So that's where accountability actually comes in. Then from that, leading on to that takes you to assessment and then learning. Because my view would always be that crisis is not always doom and gloom. It can also present opportunities, if you like. And I think during your assessment phase and learning phase, that's where we then begin to think in terms of the actions to reform, if you like, what has already happened or what has emerged from the crisis. And the takeaways, if you like, from the crisis would enable you to strengthen your processes, systems, and people in a way that they can embrace opportunities that the crisis might actually present. So crisis for me is not a time for blame gaming, if you like. It requires, in my view, decisive steps to mitigate, if not reverse, the conditions that are actually causing people to be anxious during the crisis. And I think that's where leaders come in. So if you look at what has gone on through the COVID crisis, the confusions were there because people didn't understand or even have confidence in the information that were being put out there, because it's constantly changing and also evolving. But the velocity of the crisis itself is raising people's anxieties and worries. But even the plans that have been put in place, in most cases, actually fail to consider the full ecosystem. And we see that in the case of Leicester. Look at what is happening there now. Because if you go back in March or January, no one actually thought about Leicester, how something like that can actually come up. So for leaders, this is a very good time to be a leader, by the way, an organizational leader, because the weight of expectations is on you, if you like. But it's also but it's also a good time to probably allow situations to thrust you into, if you like, effective leadership. And I think with COVID, I cannot remember for my life, I'm probably early 40s now, I cannot remember in my life where there have been so many people working online. Out of that 40 years of my life, I've probably worked a better part of those years, 20 years. So I've never encountered or seen a situation where there's so many people across the world working remotely. So that for me is an upshot of what future organizations might look like, or future working might look like. We cannot just simply sweep it away. It's going to be an integral part of organizational life. So it's important that leaders probably change the way they lead. So you expand what I call your diagnostic lens in terms of getting to the bottom of the issues. So because I've always argued and continue to argue that the way leaders and organizations manage performance is actually wrong. So it's only recently, only in the last 5 years, that the focus has moved from the individual to how the individual is actually doing their job. So it's important you focus on the performance and not on the individual. But also, we have to show empathy, if you like, without necessarily lowering the bar of expectation. My view is that crisis is not a recipe, or it's not an excuse for substandard performance. You still have to have those level of high expectations. So we don't confuse empathy with lowered expectations, or even compassion with cowardice. So we can only show empathy by understanding employees' struggles, but also acknowledging their hardship. But within that, demanding that they redouble their efforts in a way that actually helps them succeed. So as a rule of thumb, I've always advised leaders to check in before they check on. And what that simply means is that asking employees in these circumstances, probing questions about how they feel. So you clarifying expectations and goals, and making them understand that crisis doesn't actually necessarily let people off the hook from delivering the same level of, if you like, result as they did before the crisis. So that moves on to engaging the underperformer. There's always a temptation to tell people what to do, because that's like a quick fix. But it's important at this time that you actually put people who may be affected by the issues that you're worried about within your organization front and center in solving the problems that you're dealing with. So once you identify what the issues are, you simply redirect the situation back to them by asking them questions about how they feel change should come about. But it's also a time to strengthen accountability. So it's important we ask employees how they rely on one another. So without you, how can they pull through? So that's as important. But of course, it means that you have to make tough decisions as a leader. So decisions are not just always about internal decisions, but also there are decisions that are external facing. So apart from layoffs, which is always something that leaders are tempted to do, during crisis, in my view, that's the time to really put employees first, to retain them, to redeploy them if necessary, but also importantly, pay them. So communicating the company's financial situation is as important as discussions about pay cuts, if you like. You may also be wanting to renegotiate employee contracts. This is something that I found leaders or organizations tend to shy away from, but that's important. It's important to have an open and honest discussions about them, set a roadmap for any shortfall as a result of the cuts that they are taking, if you like. But of course, the cuts has to be tiered in a way that highly paid people take a bigger hit. I know some CEOs are taking salary cuts anyway. So those who are highly paid within the organization should actually take, if you like, in my view, a bigger hit. But I think there's no place that has proven so difficult and tricky for organizations during crisis as with renegotiating their contracts with third parties, be it suppliers or even your landlord. I can understand there are different, if you like, leasing positions. So organizations may be in different stages in their lease contract, if you like. So I think the most important thing there is to understand your landlord's position. You cannot be afraid not to have those sort of conversations with your landlord. You just have to, if you like. But I think the first step is to really understand your own cash position and also your landlord's cash position, their attitude towards risk, if you like, their ability to actually bear rent reduction, and also the contractual obligations. So you go to them with a solution. So you share the risks as well as the reward, if you like. But it's also time for even well-established organizations to be more entrepreneurial in their approach to solving some of the problems that a crisis presents. So this is a time normally reserved for startups, if you like. But you find that as businesses, they are cash squeezed at this point. So one potential pathway for generating income could be, or even surviving, could be using some structures and ideas that are ordinarily reserved for startups. So you're looking at thinking of paying creditors in equity, shared ownership, if you like, or even perhaps sharing intellectual property, as it were. So these are some of the things that you might want to think about. But again, it's important that we don't confuse re-entry with recovery, because those are two distinct things, if you like, components in the whole process. So it cannot be business as usual, of course. So I suppose that's where organizational resilience, authenticity, and also connection comes in. Crisis, any crisis of this sort would always leave disruption, severe challenges, but there are also opportunities, if you like. So I see government becoming more involved in industries, especially in sectors and services that are critical to infrastructures. So say utility, travel, healthcare, and the rest of it. So, and that means more regulation for businesses. I see relocalization of what I call global supply chains. This crisis, as with any crisis, would always disrupt global supply chains. So I believe the unseen and inevitable hand of globalization will be pulled back. So businesses will begin to look inwards, how they can actually be part of their local supply chains and reduce the overdependence on, if you like, global supply chains. And I think that's where technology probably comes in, if you like. So I see digital technologies and skills being taken center stage. It will accelerate in terms of adoption, especially those that enable businesses or business activities with less human contact. So including things like e-commerce, virtual working, virtual networking, and robotization of the workplace. But there's a caution here. I don't think that it is well known yet the extent to which workers are willing to actually embrace digitalization. So this is something that as leaders, you may have to think about without physical contact. That is a real issue for every business across the world. So all this talk about everything will be virtual, oh, hooray, Tom and Jerry will be nice. No, because people are still very, very cautious about how their personal details or information actually being used. And of course, this will have implications for employment rights, including data privacy. So that's an issue there, if you like. And if you ask me, as a leader, it's not surprising. If you look at a study by globalceos.org that track CEOs across the world, I wasn't surprised that 62% of CEOs, of global leaders like you, are not really active on social media. For all sorts of reasons, we can debate that, okay? But that is going to change now because you have to gain visibility into your customers' space. With more than 2 billion people in the social media space, particularly millennials and Generation Z, I believe that's where the action lies. That's where the gravity now lies. So COVID has accelerated that, if you like. So people are spending, before the crisis, people are spending about 2 hours roughly on average on social media. But with the crisis, that has more than doubled to 3 to 4 hours. And that's where they're talking about what they're interested in, what they want to do, and how they want to do it. So social media, I would imagine, would give business leaders a direct pipeline to get insight into what their customers are thinking, into what their employees are thinking and doing, real time, unfiltered, okay, from the media spin or influence. But it means that you have to build trust both inside and outside the organization. So for me, the era of an aloof leader or CEO is dead. Because increasingly in the future, organizations will become even a political space. So what I call employees' personal space and professional context will become increasingly narrowed. And that means the implication for leaders, they must build trust and rapport with employees and their customers within that space. It will require offering a real human face to issues, including global issues that affect employees. And the social media represents one of the most powerful ways for leaders to actually use resources efficiently and effectively at scale. We are seeing that already happening. So if you look at what has happened with the Black Lives Matter triggered by the death of George Floyd, you see that businesses are coming out. Leaders are coming out. We see that with Amazon. So when you log on to Amazon, you see that it's there. So organizations and places where we do business are no longer shielded, will no longer be shielded from what is happening widely, if you like. So my view, another implication there would also mean that because of the access to information, organizational hierarchies will increasingly be dismantled, will increasingly be crushed, okay? Because if you look, I mean, with global institutions and leadership fragmented and polarized, I was discussing this with Emma earlier on before you guys actually came on board, amid accelerating what I call natural and technological disruption. Businesses are constantly having to adapt to a new world order, okay, in which information environment is continually also evolving. So the efficacy of top-down approach to information is no longer there. The efficacy of top-down approach to regulating people's behavior can no longer survive. So it seems to me radical trust and transparency is here to stay. And I think that's a major challenge for leaders, for you as business owners, if you like, or business leaders. Because all of this has implications for workers' rights. They have implications for employee rights. So if you look at millennials and Generation Z, they are much more likely and much more inclined to challenge authority, to challenge systems and processes that were before now conferred by age and experience. So it's something that as leaders, you have to think about how you leave your social footprints or how you leave your footprints. What message are you putting out there to benefit both your employees and your customers? But also social media also provides you with that intimate space for dialogue with your employees, for dialogue with your customers. So you may also publish your excitement about new products or new services or new joint venture or new CSR and all that, or how you're making your workplace, obviously, if you like, inclusive. So it cannot be the fact that information and knowledge are limited to a particular demographic, if you like, or a particular class. I think all of that will be dismantled. Organizations will become an increasingly much more inclusive space. Without inclusivity, you will hinder exchange of ideas, choke off innovation, and also employee loyalty. These are some of the things that you really, really need. But of course, with recovery and as the global lockdown eases, leaders should be thinking about what sort of skills they should be bringing to the workplace. I see opportunities. So before I talk about where I see opportunities, I will talk about what sort of skills that I would like to just emphasize a few skills leaders might be thinking about. I see opportunities in some sectors, aviation, consumer, oil and gas and all the rest of it. But here's the deal. There has to be systems in place to rapidly reskill and upskill the workforce. Rebuilding employees' mindsets better prepares them for dealing with a constantly and even sometimes abruptly changing environment. Changes to workload during the pandemic have sometimes resulted in imbalance in terms of resource use. So reskilling and upskilling will help employee agility, as they must be able to move from one part of the business to the other. So they need to be equipped for that. Quick adoption of new technologies is also the central catalyst to accelerate creation of new roles for employees and also enable them to embrace those new roles and succeed in them. Another thing we have to probably be thinking about, apart from trust, which I have talked about, is agile working. Agile working. It has been there always, bubbling under the radar, but I think COVID has actually brought that to the foreground, if you like. So it's unprecedented, as I said before, that many workers are working remotely. So for leaders, I think leaders are beginning to have a clearer sense of what can and cannot be done outside their premises with this COVID, with this crisis. So I think what it has done is accelerated the pace and scale of workplace innovation. So leaders should be seeking for more simpler, faster, and more cost-efficient ways to operate and put in place and put their workforce and customers at the heart of their new business models. New business models will have to include things like what I call well-being framework. We simply cannot ignore or sidetrack or sidestep the effects around depression, anxiety, which have trebled over the course of this crisis. So leaders should be thinking in terms of a new framework that integrates, in my view, individuals' mental, physical, social, and financial well-being. So there has to be a framework within the organization that actually that speaks to some of these needs and constantly, if you like, evaluated.
Paschal, just a couple of comments actually that have just come into the chat box that I just wanted to bring forward. So a comment more than a question from Penny, and a really good point actually, and Paschal, one we've probably talked about a little bit in some of our discussions actually. So Penny has said it's really difficult at the moment to actually try to appease staff because we're all working remotely. Staff seem to be a little bit oblivious to the hard work that's going on behind the scenes by their leaders. The leaders are obviously trying to make sense of everything, work out how we go back, and therefore there is a possibility that as a leader we end up upsetting our team members by not seeming to take parallel and consequential social and political matters happening at the same time as seriously as we might do if there was not a pandemic. And there are only so many hours in a day for all of us, which I think you probably agree, Paschal, is a really, really interesting and really insightful point, that as leaders, and I think we've probably all maybe had this experience, we're so focused at the moment on the pandemic that actually there are other things going on in the world, and how do we manage that we're having to do all this crisis work and all this work in the background, but also remember that there are other social and political matters going on, and that we also need to address those as well. So interested to hear what your thoughts would be on that, Paschal.
Penny, I think you raised an important question that speaks to all businesses really. There's what I call holding. There's what I call leadership ability to hold an organization. Okay? So the concept of holding has both organizational imperative and also interpersonal imperative. Because you're right in pointing out that people may not really see all the hard work that is actually being done behind the scenes, okay? So when you provide, as a leader, when you provide what I call the organizational holding, by strengthening the organizational structures and the culture that affects each and every member of the organization, okay? So through putting in place or revisioning existing policies and procedures in a way that actually reassures people. It may not be at pace or at the speed with which they want information given out, but your job as the leader, again, is to manage those expectations, to help them make sense of that confusing predicament. That thought, Penny, should not leave you. That's your task, because you're not only responsible to that particular constituency that are worried, you are responsible to every constituency within that organizational framework, both those who believe in what you're doing and those who do not believe in what you're doing. So first, you put in place those policies that reassures people about their job security and how fairly the organization is treating them and willing to treat them. That is key, Penny. At the heart of why people are resisting or being anxious is because they are not sure where their next penny is coming from. So when you reassure people that as to the security of their jobs and what the organization is doing very well in or willing to do for them to ensure the longevity of their income source, I think that in some way, to my mind and from what I have seen, will help people, if you like, make sense of what you're actually doing. Second one, it's important that we promote dialogue that encourages diverse people to participate in decisions and in adapting to new challenges together, rather than just encouraging a polarized, if you like, faction. And I think at this point, I know, Emma, this is something that we are keen to actually push across in terms of inclusivity and also diversity. I mean, if you look at, I'm going to digress a little bit here, Penny. I mean, if you look at certain sections of the business community, particularly Black-owned businesses, and it's important that we don't talk about BAME and paint everyone with the same brush, okay? It's important that we don't talk about LGBT and paint everyone with the same brush. It's important that we don't talk about all of these orientations, isn't it, that are out there in the workspace. I think for a leader, inclusivity means inclusivity, nothing less, nothing more, nothing less. Because what it does, it reassures both those who are affected by the issues and those who are not affected by inclusivity. It reassures everyone. And I think that's what you have to do as a leader, to be seen to be above all of those, if you like, wrangling. So rather than just polarizing what is already a polarized situation, what you do is the most impactful way is that holding people together that I have talked about. So, for instance, failure to push diversity of thoughts and failure to encourage diversity of opinions makes your communication about empathy and understanding ring so hollow. People will not believe you. So even those who are not being affected by who are not being positively affected by the processes and procedures that you're putting in place would also know that you're not being entirely sincere. And those who are also affected by those processes and systems that are not inclusive would also know you're not being sincere. So in the end, you don't have anyone on your side. You're really just lost, you see. So the third point, so I cannot emphasize diversity and inclusivity. And I think, Emma, as we go on with the business school response to how business is actually coping, I hope that we can look to Black-owned businesses, seriously, to develop particular interventions for them, because they were really hard done even before the crisis. So with the crisis, you would expect that the problems and the issues that they face would even be doubled, if you like. So, and then the third one is, you tell your workers what will happen to them, Penny, because they may not understand what will happen to them. Anxiety, Penny, anxiety is such an insidious variable in organizational performance, in worker efficacy, in worker authenticity, in worker commitment, in worker anything. Anxiety, not being sure what you're actually doing. So, I mean, people need to understand what will happen to their wages. You need to be clear with them about their working conditions. You need to be clear with them, upfront with them, about what the key priorities are and why those things are key priorities. You need to be clear with them upfront who needs to do what and by when. And you need to justify the measures that are actually being taken. And I think it involves actually acknowledging the distress that people are facing, the difficulty within it, by not giving in to what I call inertia or stagnation. Okay, I don't know if that addresses your question.
Just something that I've sort of been thinking about and doing some research around is also, and Penny, I know you attended Claire's e-clinic on authentic leadership a few weeks ago, and I suppose one of the areas to think about as well is, whilst there are lots of social and political matters happening at the same time, as you've identified, we have a pandemic as well as that, and then on top of that we also have everybody's mental health, personal issues at home. And I think one of the things that you can do as a leader is, and kind of going a little bit back to what you were saying there, Paschal, is don't try to just tick every box to make it look like you are addressing all of those social and political matters and the fact there's a pandemic and mental health, that's another box to tick. You know, leaders often have a habit of doing this. So something we've all seen, Black Lives Matter has obviously been a key issue and always has been, but has obviously been in the media a lot recently. Don't then just think as a leader, oh, I need to respond and tick a box and show I've done something about that, because it's not that simple. If you're authentic and you always demonstrate that you are focused on social and political matters, your employees won't expect you to just respond every time there's something in the media. You know, that issue doesn't go away. Black Lives Matter has been here for years and years and years. You can't just switch it on and decide, oh, all of a sudden I'm going to show that I'm committed to this. It's about being authentic and about demonstrating that you are always committed to these social and political matters, and also the personal and mental health of your employees. And I think if you've been a leader that has always demonstrated that to your employees, and at the moment your very focus has been on the pandemic, they will still recognise and trust and believe in you as a leader, that you've always been committed to those things. Does that make sense? I think if you've always shown it, and your focus at the moment has been on the pandemic, nobody would be questioning you to say, well, why haven't you, you know, commented on or asked me about my mental health, or why haven't you commented on this political issue at the moment? And I think it's just about being true and authentic as a leader, to show that you support all of those areas anyway, so it doesn't just become something that you address right at that minute when it comes up. So that's something I've been reading a little bit about, and about just thinking about how to make sure that you are always supporting issues rather than.
Penny, I think there's a question she wanted to ask.
Oh, Penny, yeah.
Sorry, can I just yeah, so I completely understand what you're saying, but the recent things happening and the George Floyd incident, I mean, that's angered. Doesn't matter whether we're an organisation that's inclusive and we promote it all the time. This is something much bigger and something that's much greater. And we do like to consider ourselves a very inclusive organisation. We've got our sort of principles and values on our lanyards, but it's not just a tick box. We actually do respect and value. We're a very small college. We've got a small staff of 70, and I can hand on heart say we respect each other. We treat each other well and our students. Mm-hmm. But this Black Lives Matter movement and the George Floyd incident is so much bigger, and something that needs addressing by every company a lot more than anything in any way that has been addressed before. However, it is absolutely massive, but so is the pandemic. And I just personally, I do have staff saying, what are we doing and why aren't we doing this and that? I completely understand, and it's very difficult for me to say, well, yes, I know, and yes, we should be doing that, and I shall put that to the principal or whoever. But at the same time, I know that I've got to get a report out. I've got to work out signage around the building of how we're going to be getting back, because there's an urgency, and reporting to the principal about other things that I'm doing to help everybody get back. But I can't really tell everybody what I'm doing. And some of the things that we're talking about regarding staff and being open and honest, I think we have been that, but it is really difficult because we don't know what we're going to be doing in a month. We might be making 10 people redundant. We might be needing to employ 10 people. So that's really difficult, because us being unsure makes it look as if we're not telling people things, whereas we don't actually know the answer.
I think it's a little bit about separating those. So I agree with what you're saying there, in terms of there is an expectation, of course, of the organisation to respond to current issues. But I think where I was sort of going with is separating the organisation and you as a leader. So you as an individual, the people that report directly into you, if they can see that you're authentic, they will trust that you will do something about it, I suppose is what I meant. Is if the people that report directly into you as a leader trust that, yes, you may have been busy with X, Y and Z today, but you're not just going to ignore that issue, that will help with that. So that's what I mean by, yes, there is an expectation, and obviously what you don't want to do is tick a box. And actually sometimes if as a leader you feel pressured to tick a box, you actually do something that's not authentic. Whereas if your team members already trust and believe in you as an authentic leader, they will know that whilst today you might be doing a risk assessment on X, Y and Z, that you haven't just pushed that issue to the back of your mind and forgotten about it, I suppose, as a person rather than as an organisation. And that's something I've just been looking at for my own development.
With Emma trying to probably, you have to separate yourself from the organizational issue, because in most cases, as I have found, leaders in crisis, what they are trying to actually do, and I think that's where the issue around authenticity actually comes to the foreground, is that you're helping your team deal with the emotional volatility of the situation. And it goes back to the point you made earlier, Penny, about putting our plans there authentically, but because of the uncertainty and the lack of information and the reliability of the information that is actually there, when you do put out those plans and they're not effective, it comes back to you as if you haven't thought about them, or there is something, less than honest about you. No, but what you're really doing is you as an individual helping people deal with the emotional volatility of the crisis. You cannot solve all the problems, and they know that. I think in my view, I'll be worried or hesitant if my leader is trying to solve all the problems.
Yeah, that's what
we don't have time to do them effectively.
Yeah,
as you
exactly.
say, tick boxes are not what we do.
No.
But also, I think it goes back, Paschal, to what you said right at the very, very beginning. You're going to get the disgruntled, and you're going to get the hard workers. There's no in between. And we are treating I'm glad, listening to you, I'm glad that I've heard of the webinars as well. We are doing what we can. It sounds as if we're on the right road, and we're very much aware of the well-being and mental health issues that could arise amongst all of us, myself included. So we are addressing those with staff, and I think we've handled everything very well, I have to say. But I suppose if you've got staff that were already disgruntled, then now they're most likely going to be very disgruntled.
More disgruntled.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yes, so I suppose you're right. Don't take it personally, because there's nothing I can do. If I do my best to give my own view, discuss, because I think actually what maybe we could do more of, and I have heard this, is to talk. I do think after the George Floyd incident and other things about the climate change is a massive thing as well. I do think maybe we do need to have dialogues with staff that maybe we haven't had.
Penny, I tell you what, Penny, and look, I'm saying it. I mean, I finished a chat with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, a webinar like this, talking to government leaders and politicians and some business owners as well. What I have seen and found is that the organizational space post this crisis will increasingly become a political space. Yeah. So as a leader, it's how you box and cox it. There are no easy solutions. There is no roadmap there is no template as to what you can and cannot do. But what I am sure and confident about is that leaders, be it FTSE 100 leaders or whatever, wherever you are, you cannot not be part of that space and conversation. And I think what you have to think about is the easy way, which I shared with this particular group, it was a much larger group, it's you have to separate what I call employees' professional context from their personal context. And when I talk about employees' professional context, what I really mean is that you have to understand their intent. You have to understand their insights. You have to understand their interests. Their intent, what they want to do. What is it they want to do? Their insights, what is it they know? But also their interest, what do they like? So as a leader, you have to bring all of this into your pouch. And that means migrating into their personal space in some form. And I think social media allows you to, my vice chancellor has done incredibly well over this crisis. I cannot see anyone who will fault what Jeff has done. He hasn't given us all the answers. Some of the things he's put out there I disagreed with, but I agree that this is the solution. There's nothing else he could have done beyond that. So he was seen all over the place. So he was on social media talking about what the organization is doing. So Penny, John, Sam, and also, you're not just talking to your employees anymore. You're talking to your customers as well. So I think that is the hard ask. And I think in the end, by helping one another, and if you go back to the concept of holding, when I talk about organizational holding, Organizational holding, when you get it right, overlaps with what I call interpersonal holding. Because organizational holding, where you look at the structures that actually give employees platform, when you get it effective, I'm not talking about right or wrong here, Penny, and the rest of it. I'm talking about when when those structures are effective. So when they are doing what they are meant to be doing, then that lays the groundwork for what I call interpersonal holding. So where people peer-to-peer help naturally comes in. So when you can, it has to be a time, and also post that, when you actually help one another's pain, loss, struggles, trying to lift people up, then you are helping them to find new meaning within that crisis. I suppose that's what this is about. It's not a time to resort to command and control. It's not a time for brown nosing. It's not really a time for pulling people down or blame gaming. And I think when those conditions are met, then as a leader, you can be reassured in your own self that you're bringing up a team, a real team, that when the time comes to articulate a new vision of change for the organization, you already have a team that are there for you. And this is where I take you back to my final thoughts. As leaders,
Paschal, sorry to interrupt, but we do have a few more comments actually in the
please.
chat box that I don't want us to ignore, as they're really good points. So thank you everyone for those. So Joan commented just after Penny's comment actually, when we were talking about reassuring people. So how can you reassure people about the safety of their jobs when this crisis is so unpredictable? And Sam has also sort of responded to that as well, around how much is communication a vital component of taking your employees along in the era of working from home. And actually the two probably go quite hand in hand really. So it is a nerve-wracking time for individuals, and Joan raises a good point there. As much as we might want to be a fantastic leader and be reassuring, how can we absolutely do that when actually there may be some unpredictable things that occur that do put people at risk in terms of their jobs? So what can we do about that?
I think it would be disingenuous for me to pretend that we have all the answers. I think Joel and Sam both raised very important exploration issues actually. Every crisis brings with it both winners and losers. That's just the nature of it. But I think if you go back to what we talked about around authenticity, employees actually do care about the stability of their income source. They do care about it genuinely. When I talked about tough decisions, if you go back to what I said about tough decisions, there'll be layoffs. that's just inevitable, you see. So, but I think having those sort of difficult conversations with people, and I suppose the challenge, Joan, there it's what are the criteria you will use to actually lay people to decide who must go and who must stay? Isn't it? How would you put credence or give those sort of criteria, if you like, credibility? And I think as organizations, when you're laying people off, I think I talked about this in a different forum. Perhaps it might be relevant here. It's not entirely good to simply decouple yourself from that employee. What I see, employees don't have a framework whereby those who they are laying off, for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter, COVID or whatever, they should have a pathway to help those individuals reintegrate themselves back into the industry or another industry. Of course, you have to pay them all their employment rights, all the rest of it. But in addition to that, as an organization, you should have a pathway, a holding pathway, a cell, where you say, look, you've been laid off, but this is a scheme we are running as an organization. Free, you don't have to pay anything for it. It could be that it provides you a pathway to reskill yourself, to gain more confidence in taking on other jobs, and we will support you with that. We would even put referrals, support you with that. So employees who have been affected by a crisis or an outcome of a crisis situation, or even unrelated to crisis, they stand to benefit if they know that their organizations have a scheme, a program in place that would enable them to re-enter the job market, whatever that job market is, wherever that job market is. It could be part of your CSR. I said this in a much bigger forum, but and I think that got a lot of flack because that's not, organizations don't have time for that. They don't even have resources for that, you see. So it could be something that you're thinking about. I mean, it's very much like, I think I'm going to veer into the mundane here. It's very much like in a relationship. When you've had an enjoyable relationship, and for some reason that relationship cannot continue, you don't simply completely cut off from that partner. You could still remember their birthdays. You could still call them up. You could still involve them in things that you're doing. There has to be a professional template for that. So because what you're trying to deal with is the psychological effect of dislocation. That's what you're trying to deal with, the psychological effect, because individuals are much more able to respond to the psychological impact of something because it has an impact on their mental well-being than the physical, is it? So the physical being, oh, I don't have steady source of income anymore. But if you give a pathway to enable that can serve as what I call enablers to re-enter the job market, and the organization is taking that responsibility to helping those people, I think in my view, it's a much more humane way, and it's a much more, in my view, a humanistic way to actually approach it, if you like. Remember, leaders do things right. Isn't it? That is different between leaders and managers. Managers do the right, no, leaders do the right things and managers do things right. You have to get that, you know.
I suppose also, Paschal, going back to what we were talking about as separating the organisation and the leader as well, is if you did work for an organisation perhaps that wouldn't put something like that in place, for example, and perhaps you weren't in a position to put that in, you, again, ensuring you're an authentic leader where you personally don't just cut contact with that individual. So even though you might not be able to get the organisation to open up those platforms, you may have personal networks. So again, being authentic, and you know, if you have got to lay somebody off, of course it's something that you don't want to do, but you may not have much of a choice, unfortunately. But again, you can be an authentic person, and although it's not going to necessarily make things better for that individual immediately, but you know, if you did have contacts perhaps that you could introduce them to, or ways in which you could support them to find new work, then again you would be doing the best that you can possibly do within the control of what you have. And even though it may not necessarily wave a magic wand and solve the problem, it would again still demonstrate that you are an authentic person and that you're supporting where you can, even if you can't make that happen from an organisational perspective.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. Remember when you ask people to leave, as I have done, I have had to be in a situation where I have sacked people. But of course, I've also, alongside that, provided them a pathway, isn't it, to re-enter into. Because what I found from talking to those people was that it was not the physical aspect of losing income, but it's the psychological component of rejection. That is much more what they are struggling with. And you need to fix that to enable them to re-enter the physical world. You know, I don't know if you have a view there, Sam, because I think you were I think you were complimenting what John was saying, if you like.
So yes, so it's going back to Sam's point, obviously, about communication as well. So communication in terms of working from home. And Joan has, I think, responded to that in terms of, you know, the coordination needs to be well coordinated. Standardized communication systems, absolutely. Protocols to ensure clear and transparent communication with all stakeholders. So absolutely, ensuring that whether people are at home or scattered around the country or in an office, that actually they don't, you know, they still get the same communication, and that just because somebody's at home, they don't get less info just because they're not in the office. Also, another question from Sam, another really good question: do we expect bad leaders to change as a result of COVID-19, or are they beyond reproach? Oh, really good. These are really good.
That's a very good one. Well, these are senior leaders in the organization. I don't think, I think I mean, 10 years of doing this, I've never used the word bad leaders or good leaders. I've always used effective or ineffective leaders. That's my choice of words, because saying bad makes it emotive. You see, I have to decouple my emotions from the word context. You see, I think for ineffective leaders, they will be swept away by the force of change. In fact, they may not even be leaders. They will be simply swept away by the powerful, by the disruptive force of change. Because you cannot not respond to the conscience of your followership. Remember that there's no leadership without followership. If you haven't got people who actually believe in what you're doing, then that ultimately invalidates your position as a leader. So you cannot not respond to the conscience, if you like, or to the issues that those for whom you're supposed to be a leader to are actually dealing with. So in direct answer to your question, for bad leaders, however you define them, I don't know what you mean by bad leaders, but they may not even be leaders. I cannot hear you, Sam.
Yeah, I think, okay, I think you can hear me now.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much. Why I use the word bad leaders, it's just to be particular. I think having, obviously, some of us have gone through all the leadership training, and but nevertheless, there are still people who are, you can use that word for.
You know, I'm an academic, so.
And the leaders we're talking about, as you have explained through your presentation, would be those who are prepared in their psyche to understand. But there are some leaders, as quite rightly someone, John, has mentioned there, which I don't need to repeat. It's a very good example of somebody who do not want to understand.
Don't open that discussion of what.
When any leader do not want to understand, it's absolutely difficult how things can be implemented, because you wouldn't put no action in place, and people following you will be lost, and some will be, you begin to have cells of a group of people acting on their own impulses, doing their own thing. And then you have a more fragmented approach in such an organization. It might be a country, it might be organization, it might be a business. But when the leader obviously do not believe, then everything will go to pieces. Yes. So that is where most situation we're in is finding the actual new leaders, or leaders who obviously are prepared to believe or prepared to change what their psyche and their thinking is. It's where the whole issue about all that we've heard from you today relies on having someone at that position who is prepared to learn and understand and listen and communicate. That's why I brought in the idea of communication. To communicate with people you're leading, that the way forward, the way things can happen and happen better. Yep.
I think on a final, thank you very much. I mean, I don't know if you have a, is that Henry, the other guy who is?
Yes.
Is that Henry? Oh, okay, we cannot hear.
Yes,
I think just on a final thought, just to try and wrap my presentation up. I think you must, as leaders, must be asking themselves scenario-based questions. So I like the idea of scenario-based questions because they are context-specific. Because the solutions you then provide would also be nuanced towards those context-specific issues that you're dealing with, if you like. Because to stand and pretend that there is a magic bullet to all of the issues that we are talking about, or a one-size-fits-all approach to the issues that you guys deal with, both in organization and also outside the organization, is probably being disingenuous. So I like the idea of scenario-based, so you're looking at how can myself as the leader, how can the company, and also how can employees best emerge from any crisis, this crisis, any crisis, and turn it into their favor. That should be a food for thought for you. Alongside that, how can we as an organization, how can I as a leader, how can we as an organization together leverage the things in the areas that are most certain? And I think it was someone who mentioned about uncertainty. I think we talked about it. I think Penny also alluded to it. The uncertainty, the volatility of the situation makes it difficult to have certainty. The only thing that is actually certain is volatility. Okay?
It's the uncertainty.
So it will be a case of those things that we know that are certain. How can we make the most of it? That people will lose their jobs, that others, isn't it, will have those jobs, that we have to reorganize the way we behave as an organization, isn't it, and all that. Those ones are certain. So how can you then make the most of it? Another question is, what are the strategic options you have as a leader versus the strategic options you have as an organization? This is important. You need to make sure both marry each other, okay? And I think where you're taking that is in a way that you as a leader, in tandem with the organization, can act with courage and quickly when opportunities present themselves. That's important. And then finally, you have to look at where the threats are coming from. You have to also look at what I call your strategic insurances. Every organization and every leader has that. Every leader has what I call strategic insurance. Every leader has what I call a USP. What makes you you that cannot be replicated anywhere by anybody. So you have to look at those things. And I think you're using those things, or those leveragings, I call them, to then insulate yourself so that you better protect yourself against both current and future crises. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Some really good, really insightful discussions. We have run over slightly, but I'm really glad that you've all seemed to have engaged with the content and enjoyed the session. I think you all seem to have done so that's fantastic. Obviously, I think some of you do know Paschal personally anyway, to be able to pick his brains about some of these areas. However, if you do have any queries where you would like to talk to myself or talk to Paschal, then we do have our exec ed email address, which I monitor. So I will pop that in the chat box now, just so that you have got a direct contact. Sorry, I've put exceed. It's exec ed. It's autocorrect. It keeps doing that. Exec ed at wlv.ac.uk. and I'm monitoring that. So, you know, if there are any queries or on any of the other e-clinics that you may have attended, or even if you're just, you know, having a real significant challenge that you'd like to chat to one of us about, then by all means, drop us an email. We'd love to talk to you. And, you know, hopefully we can either direct you into an e-clinic that perhaps might help with that issue, or we might be able to talk to you further about any other support that we might be able to provide you with. But, you know, really, it's been a really enjoyable session. I'm really pleased some of the conversations and questions that we've had today. So thank you all very much for your time. Unless there are any other questions before we wrap up, then I really hope to see you again at a future session. And thank you, Paschal. I think big round of applause for Paschal there. Thank you for your time. He's been bogged down with lots of marking, so I've been begging and borrowing volunteers for these sessions. So thank you so much. And I think everybody's really enjoyed the session. Appreciate your time, Paschal, as well.
Thank you.
So,
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you.